There are moments in history when the silence between what we know and what we think we know grows so wide that it becomes a kind of question. A question that lingers beneath the ruins, beneath the dust settled on broken tablets, beneath the long shadows cast by civilizations that rose too quickly and vanished too cleanly. What if the stories we inherited were only fragments of something larger? What if the gaps in our oldest timelines were not accidents, but traces of something deliberately obscured or quietly forgotten by time itself? Across deserts and riverbeds, beneath layers of silt left by ancient floods, archaeologists keep finding remnants that do not quite fit the narrative. Cities older than they should be, knowledge too advanced for the age that birthed it, and names recorded on clay whose lifespans stretch far beyond the boundaries of reason. And when the earth reveals these contradictions, it offers no explanation, only a faint whisper, as if memory itself were trying to surface. Tonight, we follow that whisper into the shadows of the ancient world, where broken chronicles meet buried landscapes, and where the past seems to watch us through the veil of half-remembered myths. If history is a tapestry, perhaps some of its threads were pulled loose long ago, leaving patterns we can see, but no longer fully understand. Settle in. Let the quiet gather around you. Welcome to Cryptic Realm. If you enjoy journeys through the forgotten and the unresolved, remember to follow the path with us, because what comes next will take us deeper into the mystery. Now, let us drift into the first layer. The first riddle rises from the ground itself, from a landscape where water once ruled and then withdrew without explanation. Along the old river plains of southern Mesopotamia, the soil still holds a quiet tension, as though it remembers something the human mind has long forgotten. When archaeologists sink their tools into those layers, soft silt above, compact clay beneath, they often pause at the same place, a thin, featureless band of mud stretching across multiple ancient cities, uniform, silent, almost too clean. It is a boundary that neither time nor erosion has disturbed, a line where one world seems to end and another begins, and no one fully agrees on what truly happened. Some call it the flood layer, the geological scar left by an immense inundation around 2900 BCE, substantiated by excavations in Uruk, Shuruppak, and Kish. Others suspect a slower, quieter drowning, an environmental collapse, a river changing course, a sudden stillness that smothered villages long before history had words for such endings. Yet this layer has a strange symmetry. Beneath it lie the remnants of cultures older than Sumer, older than the first known script, older even than the earliest temples at Eridu. Above it, civilization flourishes abruptly, as if restarting from a forgotten prototype. That discontinuity unsettles even those accustomed to history's riddles. Pottery styles shift sharply. Architectural patterns reappear, but refined, almost as if remembering an earlier blueprint. Irrigation systems, advanced from the start, leave no trace of primitive experimentation. There is a sensation, difficult to articulate, yet impossible to ignore, that the first cities did not slowly evolve, but reawakened from something deeply buried. And that feeling intensifies when the earliest texts are examined. In cuneiform tablets found at Nippur and Uruk, scribes speak of a time before the flood when kings ruled for spans that defy reason. 28,000 years, 36,000, Entire eras compressed into names carved with careful strokes. Historians often reassure us that these numbers are symbolic, tied to cycles of stars or sacred mathematics. But even symbolism demands a motive. Why encode such magnitude? Why preserve reigns that stretch beyond the reach of biological life? Perhaps the landscape itself holds part of the answer. Before the rivers shrank and the marshes receded, this region was a cradle of abundance. Fish glinted through reed-lined waterways, and fertile soils allowed settlements to rise quickly. In places like Tel Abu Shahrin, the ruin of ancient Eridu, archaeologists uncovered layer upon layer of temples, each built precisely atop the last, forming a vertical memory of devotion. The earliest of these structures date to roughly 5400 BCE. Yet the mythic histories claim Eridu was the first city, the birthplace of kingship, founded in an age far older than clay can measure. The environment of that time was shifting. The Persian Gulf reached much farther inland. The climate oscillated, and as the waters moved, people moved with them. The Ubaid culture, recognizable by its elongated pottery and figurines with inlaid eyes, spread across the region in ways that defy simple migration models. Some believe they carried an early form of the knowledge later attributed to Sumer. Others see in their silent artifacts the remnants of a society already facing decline, pushing its fragments into the future through trade, ritual, or memory. But if the Ubaid were ancestors of Sumer, why does the record of their transition break so sharply? Why does writing appear suddenly, fully formed, with over 600 signs? Why do the earliest city plans show symmetry and standardized proportions as if derived from principles too mature to be first attempts? Why do myths from this region, creation stories, king lists, lamentations, describe not the beginning of civilization, but its return? Standing at the edge of Eridu's excavated foundations, one feels a strange pressure in the air, as if the earth beneath were holding its breath. The outlines of ancient temples blur into dunes, yet some remnants refuse to fade. Fragments of imported stones from lands far beyond the Gulf, shell ornaments from distant coasts, and bricks bound with bitumen from geological sources miles away. This interconnectedness does not speak of a culture just learning to build, but of one already fluent in the language of settlement and exchange. And perhaps that is why the flood layer troubles us so deeply. It marks not only a moment of destruction, but a point of amnesia, a dividing line after which humanity begins speaking again, but in a different tone, with different fears and longings. If something was lost beneath that mud, was it a memory, a technology, a worldview? Or was it merely the thread that connected human time to something older and more cyclical? The soil offers no conclusion. It only asks the same question that is echoed for millennia. How many beginnings can a civilization endure before it forgets that they were not beginnings at all? There is an unease that settles in when the oldest stories of a people begin not with emergence, but with inheritance. Among the clay tablets found in temple storerooms and private household archives across Sumer, the scribes rarely speak as if they are inventing a way of life. Instead, they write as though they are restoring one. Their myths do not describe the dawn of knowledge, but the recovery of knowledge once lost. Their kings are not founders, but recipients of something bestowed. And in those quiet admissions, a strange tension appears. How did an ancient culture, rising from a landscape recently reshaped by flood and shifting rivers, carry within it the certainty that it was remembering rather than beginning. The earliest cities cluster along waterways that no longer exist, tracing the ghost courses of rivers long since abandoned. On aerial photographs, these forgotten channels stretch across southern Iraq like veins, branching, splitting, converging again before dissolving into the desert. Settlements, Eridu, Ur, Lagash, appear along these lines with a frequency too deliberate to be accidental. It is as if the builders knew the land in a way that suggests long familiarity, not opportunistic exploration. They placed temples on raised platforms to avoid seasonal flooding, and oriented sanctuaries with a precision that seems to anticipate solstices and star paths. To the modern mind, such foresight implies time. Generations of trial, error, and observation. But the archaeological strata do not show these gradual steps. They show leaps, and in these leaps, another riddle emerges. When the first administrative tablets appear in Uruk, around 3300 BCE, they already show a sophisticated accounting system. Signs for barley, oil, silver, livestock, and labor obligations. Symbols representing fractions, even standardized numerical notations. There is no debris of simpler systems beneath them. No crude ideograms slowly refining into cuneiform wedges. The script arrives as if from a fully formed mind. Some scholars suggest that earlier writing, perhaps on perishable materials, simply did not survive. Others suspect that the intellectual groundwork was laid by cultures predating the Ubaid horizon. Yet both explanations rely on absence, an archaeological silence that grows louder the more closely one listens. It is in this silence that the myths press their claims. The Sumerians themselves spoke of the me, cosmic decrees, principles of arts and sciences, stored in the depths of the Abzu and bestowed upon cities by deities such as Enki. In texts describing these decrees, the tone is one of remembrance, not revelation. They do not describe an age of invention, but an age of recovery after catastrophe. The flood, which they believed reshaped the world, did not erase everything. It submerged the physical, but fragments of the intangible. Rituals, measures, patterns, surfaced again through those deemed worthy of carrying them. Archaeology offers tantalizing parallels. In the region of Tel Ueli, early Ubaid levels reveal architectural plans surprisingly consistent with later Sumerian temples. In Tel al-Ubaid itself, figurines with elaborate headdresses and stylized eyes hint at symbolic systems far older than their excavated contexts. These objects feel like echoes rather than origins, like the inherited gestures of a culture that once stood taller than the ruins that now remain. And yet the evidence refuses to resolve into clarity. One scholar sees continuity, another sees rupture. One points to the development of irrigation as proof of innovation. Another notes that the canals appear too efficiently designed for first attempts. The arguments shift, like the rivers that once fed these lands, leaving behind only partial truths. As the winds move across the plains near ancient Ur, they expose small fragments of pottery, each carrying its own whisper of time. Some belong unmistakably to Sumer. Others, older and quieter, defy easy categorization. When held in the hand, their surfaces feel strangely familiar, as though shaped by craftsmen who understood a tradition no longer remembered. These shards raise questions that the texts will not answer. Who taught the first masons to align bricks with cardinal directions? Who decided that temples must follow proportions later echoed in distant lands? Who first carved the wedge-shaped strokes that would become the backbone of written history? The land remains silent, but the silence itself seems intentional, as though guarding a memory that can only be approached, never claimed. And the faintest impression lingers, like a footprint dissolving under shifting sand. If Sumer was not, there are moments when the smallest fragment forces the mind to widen its horizon. A chipped seal found in the dust of an abandoned tell, or a worn figurine pulled from beneath a collapsed mud brick wall, can cast a shadow far longer than the walls themselves. In the southern reaches of ancient Mesopotamia, such objects appear in places where one would expect a linear story of cultural development. Yet the artifacts insist on something more tangled. They belong to styles that seem too mature for their layers, or too foreign to belong to a world still forming its first cities. Each discovery complicates the quiet narrative we try to impose on the past, as if the earth refuses to let itself be read in straight lines. One of these troublesome fragments emerged from the ruins of Lagash, at the edge of a temple district where worn stairways once led into chambers echoing with hymns to Ningirsu, the city's patron deity. In a layer older than the earliest monumental architecture, excavators uncovered a tiny cylinder seal carved with astonishing finesse. Rows of animals, interwoven vines, a figure holding what appears to be a measuring rod. The carving style, however, does not match the expected evolution of local art. It is neither crude nor experimental. It is accomplished, almost as if the artist carried a tradition that began long before the city took shape. This dissonance repeats itself. Across early Mesopotamian sites, motifs appear that resonate with cultures older or geographically distant. The so-called Ophidian figurines, with elongated skulls and almond-shaped eyes, many dating to the Ubaid period, have parallels in regions as far-flung as Anatolia and the Levant. Their purpose remains unknown. Deities, ancestors, or symbols of a ritual language that did not survive the flood layer. The silence of the past refuses to offer any firm answer. Yet these figurines linger in the mind, their expressions both serene and inscrutable, as though they carry memories we are not meant to fully decode. Some scholars argue that these anomalies represent trade or contact, simple exchanges of goods and motifs among early cultures. Others suspect that the recurrence of similar forms hints at a deeper shared origin, a common thread woven through human memory long before written history found its voice. The debate persists because the evidence, while abundant, is scattered. No single find confirms a forgotten era, yet together they unsettle the idea that Sumer developed in isolation from forgotten predecessors. Even the tools used for construction complicate the narrative. At Chogamish, to the north, stone blades dated to the late 7th millennium BCE show manufacturing techniques that seem oddly advanced for their time. Some are so precisely flaked they resemble tools from much later periods. Meanwhile, early copper artifacts from sites like Tepigara suggest a familiarity with metal that predates the expected timeline of metallurgical knowledge. Such discoveries blur the boundaries between eras, as though remnants of a different technological memory were embedded within cultures, struggling to rebuild their world after some earlier disruption. Walking through the excavated ruins of Eridu, one sees these layers rise like steps in a forgotten hymn. The earliest sanctuary is small, humble, built with fresh clay, shaped by hands still experimenting with architecture. Yet only a few layers above, the structures become more refined. Longer walls, symmetrical rooms, altars placed with intention. It is not a smooth ascent, but a series of jumps, as though each generation remembered something new, or perhaps recovered something old. The pattern feels less like innovation and more like recollection. Among the texts that survive from later centuries, a recurring motif deepens the mystery. Sumerian hymns often speak of divine knowledge descending into cities, bringing order where there had been none. But in their phrasing lies an odd humility. The scribes do not describe themselves as inventors, but as caretakers of gifts entrusted to them. The me, the decrees that shaped civilization, are portrayed not as human achievements, but as the return of a wisdom lost and found again. It is difficult to ignore the tone of these writings, the soft resignation that they are echoes rather than origins. If the first cities of Sumer were indeed heir to memories scattered across older landscapes, then what shaped those memories? Was it a migration, a catastrophe, or a slow fading of an earlier tradition? The artifacts whisper different possibilities, but the earth withholds its full story. And as the winds continue to strip away the sands, more questions emerge than answers, each one drawing the horizon further from reach, as though urging us to follow it deeper into the dusk of forgotten time. There is a moment when, standing at the edge of an excavation trench at dawn, when the shifting light seems to alter the meaning of everything buried beneath your feet, the outlines of mud brick walls soften into shadows. The stratified layers become less a record of time and more a quiet reminder of how fragile memory can be. In sites like Tel Brak and Tel Hamukar, far to the north of Sumer, this sensation becomes even stronger because these cities, older than many once believed, introduce yet another uncertainty into the story of beginnings. They suggest that the rise of urban life was not confined to a single cradle, but part of a wider pattern, a flicker of something shared, then lost, then resurfacing again in unexpected places. At Tel Brak, archaeologists uncovered a vast ancient settlement whose earliest layers stretch back to the 5th millennium BCE. The enigmatic Eye Temple, named for the thousands of small, stylized clay figurines with wide, circular eyes discovered within it, stands as one of the most perplexing structures of its age. These figurines, though modest in size, are haunting. Their gaze seems fixed on something beyond the earthly realm, something that may have once united disparate peoples in a shared ritual or belief. The temple itself shows signs of repeated rebuilding, much like the layers of Eridu, hinting at a continuity of purpose across centuries that the written record cannot explain. Nearby, Hamukar adds another layer of complexity. Evidence suggests it may have witnessed one of the earliest known instances of urban warfare. Slingshot stones scattered across ruined walls, traces of conflagration and sudden abandonment of structures. The scale of destruction implies organized conflict between city-level polities long before Sumer reached its peak. Such discoveries challenge the comfortable notion that early cities were small and insular. They reveal instead a world already entangled in alliances and rivalries, a world where knowledge, goods, and perhaps even myths traveled far beyond regional boundaries. What troubles researchers is the simultaneity of these developments. How is it that multiple sites across such vast distances show signs of complex settlement, ritual sophistication, and administrative planning at approximately the same time? Was there a slow spread of ideas along trade networks, carried by migrants and merchants? Or were these cities recovering fragments of knowledge embedded in human communities long before? fragments that survived some greater disruption. The Earth hints, but does not confirm. Back in the southern plains, Sumerian tradition preserves a story known as the Sumerian King List, in which kingship descends from heaven to the first cities. The list begins with Eridu, then Alulim, who reigns for nearly 30 millennia, followed by a series of rulers whose spans stretch across epochs more geological than human. Scholars often interpret these numbers as symbolic calendars or ceremonial exaggerations. And yet, the idea of descent, of something bestowed, echoes curiously with the archaeological record that shows cities rising as though from memories older than their foundations. In contrast, northern sites like Brak offer no king list, no written chronicle, no mythic record overtly describing a descent of authority. Their silence is different, almost expectant. The artifacts they leave behind, eye figurines, seal impressions, exotic stones, seem to speak through form rather than inscription. It is a language older than writing and perhaps resistant to being translated fully into words. When similar motifs appear later in Sumerian iconography, the resemblance is hard to ignore. Patterns of wide eyes, ritual platforms, and ceremonial objects suggest cultural threads winding through the landscape long before clay tablets began to preserve thought in fixed strokes. Some researchers propose a shared cultural substrate connecting these early cities, a network of ideas diffused through millennia of interaction. Others whisper of a more elusive possibility, that beneath the known layers of prehistory lies an older cycle of human organization, one erased or fragmented by natural disaster, climate change, or slow decline. If such a cycle existed, its remnants might surface as glimpses, temples aligned to forgotten star paths, technologies that seem prematurely sophisticated, or myths that remember more than they should. The Earth does not deny the possibility. It also does not confirm it. Instead, it offers small hints. Figurines with knowing eyes, shattered battle stones, temples rising from the same ground again and again, as if inviting us to look closer, but never quite revealing what lies beneath the first layer of certainty. And in this quiet withholding, one begins to wonder whether the past is less a series of beginnings and more a sequence of returns. Each city, a faint reflection of something that once stood before the world, learned to keep records of itself. In the heat of the southern plain, where the horizon wavers like a memory struggling to hold its shape, there is a ruin that has always carried an unusual weight. Uruk, with its immense walls, later immortalized in epic poetry, rises not from myth alone, but from deep layers of construction and reconstruction, a palimpsest of human intention pressed into clay. Standing among the scattered bricks, one becomes aware of a paradox. The city is both the beginning of recorded history and the inheritor of something older, something that breathes through its earliest artifacts with a familiarity that should not have existed in a world supposedly still learning to build. Archaeologists uncovering the Iana precinct, the vast ceremonial complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna, found themselves puzzled by the sudden sophistication of its earliest monumental structures. The limestone temple mosaics, made of thousands of conical clay pegs arranged into geometric patterns, display an artistic discipline that seems to emerge fully formed. There is no tentative experimentation preserved in the earth beneath them, only an immediate leap into mastery. The clay cones, some colored with pigment, suggest not merely decoration, but a symbolic system, perhaps encoding cosmology or social order. Yet the meanings have long since evaporated, leaving only the craftsmanship to hint at an invisible lineage. Nearby, the precinct known as the Anu Ziggurat reveals a similar mystery. Beneath the later ziggurat, archaeologists identified older layers of temples carefully aligned to cardinal directions. In their earliest phases, the structures are surprisingly precise, as though drawn from architectural principles refined over generations. The discovery of beveled rim bowls, mass-produced vessels often linked to ration distribution, adds another layer of complication. Their ubiquity suggests an organized labor force, a bureaucratic system already confident in its ability to manage resources. But the bureaucratic footprint appears suddenly, without the gradual buildup one might expect from a society discovering administration for the first time. Then there are the texts. In the archaic tablets of Uruk Level 4, some of the earliest examples of writing, one finds signs representing not just goods and quantities, but concepts, authority, temples, professions. These are not the markings of a culture tentatively inventing writing, but of one formalizing structures that already existed. The script, though primitive compared to later cuneiform, is too systematic to be the first attempt at capturing speech in clay. Each sign has variants, conventions, and rules. It is as if the scribes were not inventing a script, but abbreviating a more complex system, pruning branches of knowledge rooted in a past no longer visible. The people of Uruk worshipped Inanna as the embodiment of power, renewal, and cosmic order. Her mythology is filled with cycles, descents into the underworld, returns to the world above, shifts between chaos and structure. The stories mirror the archaeological record in uncanny ways. They describe worlds that rise and fall, knowledge that disappears and reemerges, divine decrees lost in the deep and later recovered. In the lamentations sung at nighttime rituals, there is a persistent refrain. What was once known is known again. Whether poetic or literal, the sentiment unsettles any attempt to define Uruk as simply the origin point of civilization. Some scholars argue that Uruk's abrupt rise reflects the culmination of centuries of slow cultural development across the region. Others suggest that population influx, migrations from north and west, brought skills that crystallized in the city's explosive growth. Yet neither theory fully explains the absence of experimental phases in the city's material record. The temples do not evolve, they transform. The script does not emerge, it appears. The administrative systems do not build, they manifest. Walking along what remains of Uruk's ancient wall, one senses an echo within the bricks. Gilgamesh, the legendary king, is said to have carved his story onto stone. A story of seeking immortality, confronting loss, and learning that memory itself is the only defense against oblivion. Perhaps the city he ruled embodied that same impulse, a desire to encode, to preserve, to rebuild a knowledge threatened by the vulnerability of human time. But the questions remain. If Uruk rose from the ashes of forgotten cities, where are those cities now? If its knowledge was inherited, who were the keepers before the flood washed the slate clean? And if civilization returned here, what prompted its first departure? The walls of Uruk do not answer. They only endure, their silence carrying the faint impression of an older world that once left its mark upon the clay. Along the shifting banks of the Euphrates, where the river once curled into fertile crescents before retreating into subdued channels, lies another city whose silence changes the tone of the entire story. Nippur was never a military capital, nor a seat of royal ambition. Yet its name appears again and again in ancient chronicles with a reverence unlike any other. It was the spiritual heart of Sumer, a place where kings who ruled vast territories still traveled to bow before forces older than their own empires. And within its sacred precincts, the traces of something elusive linger. Something that hints at continuity beyond political rise and collapse. The temple of Enlil, known as the Ekur, dominated the city. Its name meant House of the Mountain, a curious title for a sanctuary rising from an alluvial plain with no mountains in sight. Some have suggested the name refers to a cosmic mountain, a symbolic axis linking heaven and earth, echoing motifs found across disparate ancient cultures. But when one walks through the excavated layers of the Ekur, passing foundations that rise and fall like breaths across centuries, the metaphor feels strangely tangible. The temple was rebuilt so many times that it became less a structure and more a geological formation of human intention, a stacked memory of rituals stretching back deeper than the earliest texts. In one of the storerooms, archaeologists uncovered the Nippur tablets, fragments of hymns, administrative notes, lexical lists, and cosmological writings. Among them were early versions of myths later copied across the region, including stories of creation and flood. Yet what stands out is not what the scribes wrote, but how they wrote it. Their lines carry the tone of custodians, not authors. They do not claim to invent the order of the world, but to preserve it. And in the lexical lists, precursors to dictionaries, one senses the urgency of a people trying to record knowledge before it slips again beneath the tide of forgetting. The more one studies these lists, the more peculiar they appear. They include terms for professions, objects, animals, and rituals that no longer exist by the time they were written. Some scholars believe these lists preserve remnants of older, pre-Sumerian languages or social structures, fossilized through repetition. Others suspect they reflect traditions carried south by migrating groups after environmental changes reshaped northern Mesopotamia. But the lists do not behave like simple archives. They resemble attempts to rebuild a worldview fragment by fragment, as though the pieces were inherited without instructions. The city itself reinforces this impression. Nippur's strategic value was minimal. It sat away from major trade routes and lacked the vast agricultural hinterlands that fed cities like Uruk or Lagash. And yet every major dynasty, from the kings of Akkad to the rulers of the third dynasty of Ur to the Kassites centuries later, poured resources into restoring the Ekur. Why would foreign conquerors invest in preserving a temple tied to a culture they had subdued? Perhaps they recognized that legitimacy in this land did not stem solely from the sword or the plow, but from alignment with something older and more stable than any empire. Some researchers propose that Nippur represented the cultural memory core of Mesopotamia, a place where ideas older than written history were quietly maintained through ritual and oral tradition. The excavated layers of the Ekur show extraordinary consistency in orientation, layout, and function across millennia. Even as political powers shifted violently around it, the temple changed only in size and refinement, never in essence. It is as though its blueprint was anchored to a principle too deeply rooted to alter. And then there is the puzzling matter of astronomical alignment. While the evidence remains debated, some scholars note that the temple's axis corresponds not only to cardinal directions, but to star paths associated with agricultural cycles and celestial governance. If true, this suggests that the people of Nippur observed the sky with a continuity unusual for societies emerging from environmental upheaval. It hints at knowledge carried forward rather than rediscovered. Knowledge perhaps surviving a rupture in human memory. Standing amid the ruins at dusk, one can imagine the temple courtyards filled with priests reciting hymns designed not merely to honor gods, but to synchronize human life with cosmic order. The chants echo faintly in the mind, even though the words are long eroded. Perhaps that is the real puzzle of Nippur. Not its rituals, nor its architecture, but the unwavering conviction that what it guarded was not merely sacred, but inherited from a time when the boundary between earth and sky was different. And as the last light fades across the plain, the unanswered question remains suspended in the air. If Nippur held the memory of an older world, how much of that memory survives in the fragments we read today? And how much has dissolved beyond recall? The further one travels across the shifting plains of ancient Mesopotamia, the clearer it becomes that the landscape itself once stood at a crossroads of worlds, one remembered, one forgotten, and one continually reconstructed from the fragments of both. If Nippur preserved the theological pulse of Sumer, then Kish occupied a different kind of threshold, the point where mythic kingship is said to have descended after the Great Flood. The city's very name appears in the Sumerian King List as the first seat of rule in the post-Diluvian age. But the archaeological layers beneath it complicate rather than clarify that narrative. Kish lies near the old courses of the Euphrates, not far from where river and canal once braided through the landscape like strands of memory. Excavations conducted in the early 20th century revealed an unexpectedly deep occupational sequence. Beneath the levels associated with early dynasties, researchers found crude mud brick structures, pottery styles reminiscent of northern cultures, and tools suggesting contact with regions far beyond the Mesopotamian plain. Some layers appear abruptly, as if new groups arrived or older ones reassembled after dispersal. Yet despite these shifts, the city rises as though answering a call older than its own foundation. One object unearthed at Kish has long captured scholarly attention: the so-called Kish tablet, often described as one of the earliest known examples of writing. Its signs are not fully developed cuneiform, but neither are they rudimentary. They occupy a peculiar middle space, symbols that feel like remnants of a script already familiar to its users, rather than the hesitant marks of a society discovering literacy. The tablet's existence challenges the tidy idea that writing emerged first in Uruk and radiated outward. It hints instead at parallel traditions or shared foundations deeper than the flood sediment that separates one age from another. The graves of Kish add another layer of enigma. Excavations of the early cemetery revealed burials accompanied by copper tools, beads made from distant stones, and pottery of curious hybrid design. Some tombs contain bodies laid out with a formality resembling later Sumerian rites. Others follow patterns unfamiliar to the region. The diversity suggests movement: people arriving from lost settlements, survivors of environmental shifts seeking new centers of stability. Yet all are woven into the city's fabric, as though drawn by an ancient gravitational pull toward this place where kingship was believed to have descended after the waters receded. The King List claims that the first post-flood rulers reigned in Kish for centuries, but the archaeological record paints a more complex picture. Power seems diffuse in the earliest layers, not centralized. Leaders may have existed, but their authority was anchored in communal memory rather than monumental architecture. It is only later that the city takes on the recognizable forms of kingship: palaces, temples, administrative buildings, rising with deliberate purpose, as if catching up to a destiny assigned long before. Some researchers propose that Kish represents the point where fragmented communities reorganized after widespread disruption, perhaps caused by climatic fluctuations around the late 4th millennium BCE. If so, then the mythology of kingship descending may reflect not divine intervention, but the consolidation of memory, groups merging their traditions into a shared narrative that could hold them steady in a newly unstable world. Yet there is something about the city's early layers that resists such rationalization. The abrupt coherence with which Kish emerges, its symbolic placement in the King List, and its persistent association with renewal make it difficult to dismiss the mythic tone that surrounds it. A peculiar inscription found in later strata speaks of restoring what was before, a phrase also found in Nippur and Uruk. The repetition suggests a shared worldview across cities that did not always share rulers. They believed themselves heirs, not founders, of a civilization repeatedly broken and reborn. Whether this belief arose from collective trauma, inherited memory, or the lingering influence of a vanished culture remains uncertain. But the words carry a quiet weight, as though the scribes were whispering through time that something essential lay behind the visible layers of history. Walking across the ruins of Kish today, where the earth lies folded and cracked beneath an unrelenting sun, one feels the sense of waiting, of a place caught between what it once held and what it can no longer reveal. The wind moves across the low mounds, scattering dust into the abandoned trenches, as though trying to erase the outlines humans have drawn in their search for answers. Whatever happened at the threshold after the flood, whatever memory coalesced into the first kings of the new age, remains buried beneath questions that deepen rather than fade. And in that lingering quiet, a deeper uncertainty takes shape. If Kish was the beginning after an ending, what ending came before? And how many times had the world already turned through that cycle? There are landscapes where the earth rises gently into low mounds, so subtle that an untrained eye might overlook them entirely. Yet beneath these modest hills lie stories of cities that flickered briefly, burned intensely, and then vanished under layers of abandonment. One such place is Shuruppak, remembered in later texts as the city of the flood hero Ziusudra, a figure whose story would echo through Babylonian myths and eventually seep into later traditions far beyond Mesopotamia. But archaeology's quiet revelations around this site complicate the line between legend and lived experience, suggesting that the memory of a cataclysm may not be poetic invention, but the echo of real upheaval. Excavations at Shuruppak uncovered something few expected: a distinct layer of river-deposited silt, a compact band of fine clay lying between older domestic structures and newer ones. The sediment contains freshwater shells and microstratification consistent with a sudden inundation. Not a gentle seasonal overflow, but a flood forceful enough to erase architecture and livelihoods in one sweep. Radiocarbon dating places this layer around 2900 BCE, aligning strikingly with independent flood layers found at Uruk and Kish. None of these layers constitute evidence of a world-drowning event, yet together they hint at a regional catastrophe profound enough to fracture cultural continuity. The ruins surrounding this flood layer speak of a settlement that did not merely endure the disaster, but re-emerged with unexpected vigor. In the levels above the silt, pottery appears more refined, tools more standardized, and houses more carefully laid out. It is as though the community, once scattered by the waters, regrouped with renewed purpose, drawing upon something older than the trauma itself. The myth of Ziusudra, saving the seeds of all life, may well be metaphor, but metaphor has roots. And these layers of sedimentary silence feel like a record of survival carved directly into the landscape. Among the discoveries at Shuruppak are administrative tablets containing early forms of writing. Unlike the archaic signs of Uruk, these tablets focus on lists, grain rations, labor distributions, livestock records. They show the rhythm of a society rebuilding through meticulous order, structuring its days around the management of scarcity and the preservation of stability. Yet in the margins of some tablets, archaeologists noted small anomalies, signs unfamiliar, perhaps the vestiges of older logographic systems or the hurried attempts of scribes merging traditions under pressure. The tablets feel like transitional artifacts, situated between the collapse of memory and the reconstruction of a world that cannot fully recall its past. More curious still are the remnants of domestic life uncovered beneath collapsed walls. Hearths, carefully arranged around central courtyards, suggest extended families living in clusters, sharing labor and rituals. Grinding stones, spindle whorls, and loom weights speak of continuity, tasks that survived the flood unchanged. But in some dwellings, there are objects seldom found in earlier strata. Carved amulets with motifs hinting at distant cultural ties, and storage jars whose design resembles pottery from the far western plains. Whether these items arrived through trade, migration, or the scattering and returning of displaced families remains unresolved. Their presence adds texture to the idea that Shuruppak was not an isolated town, but part of a wider constellation of communities exchanging not only goods, but stories, beliefs, and perhaps memories of catastrophe. The city's later association with the flood hero suggests that Shuruppak played a role in preserving the narrative of what happened when the waters rose. One text describes how Ziusudra received warnings from a deity in a whisper carried by reeds. Another recounts his journey across rising waters, carrying with him knowledge meant to restart human life. Scholars often interpret these accounts as mythologized reflections of real disasters, oral traditions shaped over time into epic tales. Yet the archaeological presence of a clear, destructive event beneath the city gives those tales a different resonance. It suggests that the line between memory and myth may be thinner than we imagine. Standing at the site today, where reed-lined fields sway against the remains of ancient walls, it is easy to imagine how a community, shaken but resilient, might have passed down the memory of a flood so transformative that it redefined their entire history. The waters receded, but their imprint stayed, not only in silt, but in song, ritual, and record. And as the sun sinks over the plain, casting long shadows across the land that once drowned, a quiet question rises with the evening wind. If this flood left such a distinct scar, what earlier scars might lie deeper still, waiting beneath layers untouched by shovel or myth? Across the desert plain, where the Tigris once twisted in restless braids, another city rises from the dust in fragments. Uruk, a place whose name would echo through millennia and whose royal tombs would, much later, astonish the modern world. Yet long before the grandeur of its kings or the poetry of its moon god, Nana, the early layers of tell a quieter story, a story etched not in gold or lapis, but in foundations laid with a strange, deliberate confidence. Walking through the excavated remains, one feels as though the earliest builders were guided not by trial and error, but by some older memory of how a city should stand against time. Ur's earliest strata reveal a settlement organized around courtyards and narrow lanes, with storage areas and workshops clustered along mud brick corridors. These structures, though modest, reflect a spatial planning that seems too intentional for a community still forming its identity. The alignment of buildings respects both the river's changing moods and the steady arcs of the night sky. As later generations expanded the city, they did not erase these outlines. They amplified them, as if preserving the rhythm of something inherited rather than innovated. Among the objects found in the lower layers are clay tablets incised with the earliest linguistic traces of administrative life. These tablets contain entries for livestock, measures of barley, fish deliveries, and temple rations, mundane details that nonetheless reveal the bones of a sophisticated system. They suggest a society already comfortable with abstraction, with dividing the world into quantifiable units. Yet what lies beneath these records remains more perplexing. Pottery styles influenced by distant regions, seal impressions depicting animals not native to the immediate area, and tools whose manufacturing techniques appear unexpectedly advanced. These objects complicate the idea of Ur as a purely local development. The most dramatic discoveries, however, lie deeper still. When Leonard Woolley excavated the Royal Cemetery in the 1920s, he uncovered a layer of fine silt beneath the tombs, similar in texture to the flood deposit found at Shuruppak. He described it as a quiet flood, a period of still water that settled gently upon an older world before the city rose anew. Above this silt, he encountered burials of astonishing richness: gold headdresses, carnelian beads, lyres inlaid with lapis, and attendants arranged in eerie silence. But beneath the silt lay simpler graves, earlier dwellers whose modest possessions nonetheless hint at long-distance connections and rituals whose logic remains elusive. The contrast between these layers feels like a conversation between two eras, one interrupted, one rebuilt. It is tempting to see the flood layer as a dividing line between a forgotten age and a world that sought to reclaim its patterns through ceremony, craft, and architecture. Yet Woolley himself hesitated to draw such conclusions. He noted that the silt did not point to a singular global cataclysm, but neither could he dismiss its abrupt presence across multiple sites. It was as if a curtain had drawn across the land for a time, allowing memory to dissolve just long enough for history to restart with altered contours. What followed the flood at Ur was a period of remarkable creativity. The city's ziggurat, though built centuries later, rose from foundations that had always emphasized verticality, human structures reaching upward in response to forces that once came from above. Temples dedicated to Nana maintained strict alignments with the lunar cycle, reflecting an astronomical knowledge refined beyond simple observation. Even the standardized brick sizes used in construction echo practices seen elsewhere in Mesopotamia, suggesting a shared architectural grammar older than any single city. In the workshops around the temple precinct, artisans shaped metal with techniques surprisingly consistent across generations. Copper chisels, bronze daggers, and gold leaf ornaments appear in forms that change little over long stretches of time, as though the knowledge of how to work these materials was transmitted through an unbroken chain of memory. Whether this chain originated within Ur or extended from traditions predating the flood layer remains an unresolved question. The city's myths speak often of cycles, of lunar rhythms, renewal, and the return of order after chaos. One hymn describes Nana restoring the balance of the world after the waters withdrew, a phrase that feels like both a celestial metaphor and an earthly recollection. Poetry has a way of preserving truth without naming it directly. And perhaps these hymns reflect not imagination alone, but the persistence of communal memory carried forward through ritual. Standing amid the remnants of at dusk, when the desert wind softens and shadows blend with the outlines of ancient walls, one senses the weight of what is missing. The silence between layers feels intentional, as though something essential slipped away when the floodwaters settled into the soil. And from that silence emerges a question older than any tablet. If the people of rebuilt from fragments, what whole did those fragments once belong to? Across the plains where dust settles lightly over half-buried stones, there is a city whose memory feels strangely doubled, as though it lived two lives. One in the earth, one in the myths, whispered long after its walls fell silent. This city was Lagash, famed in later centuries for its rulers and reformers, yet the earliest layers beneath its great temple complex reveal something more ambiguous, a slow, deliberate shaping of society that hints at knowledge both preserved and transformed. When excavators first cleared its mounds, they found themselves confronted not with a single narrative, but with a mosaic of fragments that refused to align neatly. The heart of Lagash was the sanctuary of Ningirsu, a god associated with agriculture, storms, and the guardianship of civic order. The earliest temple foundations are modest, built of mud brick and bitumen, but their placement follows a pattern that suggests more than practicality. Each reconstruction, spanning centuries, preserved the same orientation and proportions as though the builders were bound to an inherited blueprint. No matter how the city shifted, how rulers rose or fell, the temple retained its silent geometry, echoing a memory older than its walls. Among the earliest artifacts found near the temple are carved stone mace heads, inscribed dedicatory plaques, and unusual figurines whose stylized forms blur the boundaries between human and animal. Their designs share certain motifs with objects unearthed hundreds of kilometers away, in regions where no direct political ties are known to have existed. These recurring patterns, serpent shapes, interwoven reeds, composite beings, appear like the faint recollections of a symbolic system once shared across a wider world. Whether these motifs arrive through trade, migration, or inheritance remains an unresolved puzzle. Lagash's archives, found in later strata, offer glimpses into the city's structure as it matured. Tablets detail land disputes, grain allocations, temple obligations, and the responsibilities of canal maintenance. They describe a society negotiating the delicate balance between civic authority and divine mandate. But beneath these well-organized administrative texts lies an earlier silence, a period for which writing is scarce and material culture shifts abruptly. It is a gap that suggests not absence, but a transition, a space between worlds in which memory recalibrated itself. One of the most significant figures associated with Lagash is the reformer Uruk, whose edicts, often considered among the earliest legal reforms, were aimed at curbing corruption and restoring what he called the former way. His inscriptions are not merely administrative. They carry a tone of recovery, of reaching backward toward an order believed to have existed before exploitation distorted civic life. When he speaks of restoring justice, he describes it as returning to an older template rather than envisioning something new. This sentiment resonates with echoes already present in Lagash's physical layers. The repeated rebuilding of a temple whose layout never strays, the recurrence of symbols whose meanings seem forgotten yet persist in form. The canals of Lagash also reflect this interplay between innovation and remembrance. The city thrived on its irrigation systems, channels carved through the plain with precision that suggests long-standing engineering knowledge. Yet some of these canals follow courses inconsistent with natural topography, hinting that they trace routes older than Lagash itself. Paths shaped by earlier settlements, now buried beneath silt or eroded away. The landscape holds these faint impressions like scars beneath the skin, visible only when traced with patient eyes. As Lagash expanded, its relationship with neighboring Umma grew tense, culminating in one of the earliest recorded border conflicts. Tablets from the time of Eannatum describe territorial boundaries marked by stone stelae and canal lines, implying an unexpectedly advanced concept of land rights. The famous stele of the vultures, depicting battle scenes and ritual ceremonies, blends historical event with mythic imagery. Soldiers march beneath divine emblems. Fallen enemies are gathered as offerings. The fusion of the earthly and the cosmic suggests a worldview in which political disputes echoed older, perhaps even primordial conflicts embedded in collective memory. Walking through the excavated trenches today, where broken bricks lie scattered beneath relentless sun, the city feels suspended between eras. Its earliest layers hint at a world recovering from disruption. Its later ones reveal a society wrestling with continuity and change. The temple's proportions, the symbolic artifacts, the canals drawn across the land, all whisper of a lineage that Lagash inherited but could not fully articulate. And as evening shadows lengthen across the ruins, a lingering uncertainty emerges. If Lagash's builders were following patterns they barely understood, then where did those patterns originate? And how much of that origin still lies hidden beneath the layers untouched by modern hands? Northwest of the Sumerian heartland, where the plains begin to rise into rolling foothills, lies a region often overshadowed by the grand cities of the southern delta. Yet within these quieter landscapes, traces of another kind of memory linger, less monumental, but perhaps more revealing. The sites of Tepe Gawra and Tel Arpachia, far from the centers of later empires, preserve layers of human activity that seem to whisper of an age before writing, before kingship, before even the idea of a city had settled into certainty. Here, the ground does not merely record the birth of new practices. It hints at something more elusive, traditions carried forward from an earlier world. At Tepe Gawra, archaeologists uncovered a sequence of temples predating the monumental centers of the south by centuries. These early sanctuaries, constructed with surprising architectural sophistication, include recessed niches, altars, and even painted motifs. Their existence challenges the notion that religious architecture evolved solely within the Fertile Crescent's southern cities. Instead, they suggest a broader cultural horizon, a network of communities experimenting with ritual space, long before the earliest Sumerian ziggurats towered above the plains. What makes these structures particularly striking is their coherence across time. Layer after layer, builders return to similar layouts, refining rather than reinventing. This kind of continuity is difficult to reconcile with the idea of spontaneous innovation. Instead, it gives the impression of ritual knowledge preserved through upheavals, earthquakes, shifting watercourses, migrations, and carried carefully into new generations. Some excavators noted resemblances between these early sanctuaries and later southern temples, as though the two regions shared an architectural memory even when separated by geography and centuries. Tel Arpachia offers its own mysteries. The so-called Halaf pottery found there, remarkably thin, painted with intricate geometric patterns, seems almost out of place in its chronological context. Its artisans demonstrated a control of firing techniques and aesthetic sensibility that rivaled much later craft traditions. Yet this finesse appears suddenly in the archaeological record, without clear precursors. The abruptness raises uncomfortable questions. Were these potters inheritors of a long refined tradition that simply left few durable traces? Or did they arise from cultural groups now lost to the erosion of time, leaving their artistry as the only surviving testament to their existence? Scattered among the ruins are figurines with exaggerated features, wide hips, delicate limbs, carefully shaped heads. Their purpose remains debated: fertility icons, ancestral representations, or ritual objects tied to some forgotten cosmology. What matters is that their forms echo motifs found across vast distances, from Anatolia to Iran, hinting at cultural connections long before the historical record acknowledges such interactions. It is difficult not to wonder whether these objects represent lingering fragments of a symbolic system that once unified distant peoples under a worldview shattered long before history began. The stratigraphy of these sites also reveals something unexpected: signs of sudden abandonment. At several levels, tools lie where they were dropped, hearths remain half-filled, and storage vessels sit cracked but intact, as if communities departed quickly and without ceremony. Such departures could be explained by conflict, drought, disease, or shifting trade routes. Yet the repetition of abrupt endings across multiple settlements gives the impression of a broader event, or perhaps a cycle of events, that forced communities to disperse and reassemble elsewhere. And in these reassemblies, new settlements often show deliberate continuity with earlier traditions, as though people sought to restore the world they had known before whatever rupture had passed through their lives. One archaeologist, reflecting on the architectural leaps at Tepegaura, noted that the builders seemed to be remembering forward, reproducing forms that appeared again in later Sumerian cities, rather than evolving them from scratch. The phrase lingers, unsettling in its implication. It suggests that the line between past and future is blurred by human memory, that civilizations do not always move in straight trajectories, but spiral through cycles of forgetting and rediscovery. If so, then the early northern sites may represent not the origin of innovation, but the preservation of remnants from an age erased elsewhere. Walking through the broken mud brick walls of these quiet mounds, where the wind carries only the soft rustle of dry grass, one senses the presence of stories still bound within the soil. These are not the tales of kings or empires, but of craftsmen, ritual specialists, and families who carried fragile knowledge across distances and disasters. Their voices remain faint, but their creations endure. Pottery that defies chronology, temples that hold their shape across centuries, figurines whose meaning slips just beyond reach. And as one stands at the threshold of these early settlements, gazing toward the plains where later civilizations would rise and fall, a quiet uncertainty emerges. If these northern communities guarded echoes of a world already fading, What greater silence preceded them? And how far back does the chain of inherited memory truly extend? There are places where the earth itself seems to carry a quiet restlessness, as though it remembers shifts in climate and coastlines that human memory could not survive. Near the edge of the Persian Gulf, where marshlands once stretched into shimmering horizons, archaeologists have begun to uncover evidence of settlements that predate the earliest known cities, and yet exist in a kind of twilight within the archaeological record. These sites, often little more than scattered foundations or tools worn smooth by time, suggest a world that thrived along the shores of a very different landscape. A world erased when sea levels rose and rivers changed course at the end of the last ice age. Geologists examining core samples from the Gulf floor discovered traces of ancient riverbeds, braided channels now submerged beneath meters of sediment. Some correspond to the old paths of the Euphrates, others to the Karun or the Wadi Batin systems that once flowed from deep within the Arabian Peninsula. These findings have prompted questions that echo across disciplines. If the delta of southern Mesopotamia once extended far into what is now open water, then where were the settlements that lined those vanished shores? And how many of them were swept away as rising seas swallowed valleys, marshes, and plains over the course of millennia? A handful of sites along the northern Gulf hint at answers without offering certainty. At Dosariya in eastern Arabia, stone tools appear in stratified layers dating to the late Pleistocene, their craftsmanship surprisingly consistent with techniques found farther north. At H3 in Kuwait, excavators uncovered a Neolithic site with evidence of seafaring, a wooden boat plank, bitumen-coated ropes, and workshops producing tools for fishing and navigation. These discoveries challenge the old assumption that early Mesopotamian cultures were strictly river-bound. Instead, they suggest a maritime tradition stretching back into periods typically overshadowed by the agricultural revolutions of the alluvial plain. Yet what stands out most is not the sophistication of these coastal communities, but their fragility in the face of changing environments. Around 6,000 TOS to 5,000 BCE, as meltwater from retreating glaciers raised global sea levels, the Gulf expanded, drowning river deltas and salt flats. Any settlements that once clung to those shorelines would have been lost. Some slowly, others abruptly. Oral traditions from later cultures across the Near East speak of lands claimed by the sea, of villages swallowed overnight, of ancestors forced to migrate inland. These stories, too easily dismissed as folk tales, may reflect memories distorted by time, memories of landscapes slipping beneath rising tides. When viewed through this lens, the sudden flourish of settlement in the Tigris-Euphrates basin takes on a different tone. Instead of a spontaneous cradle of civilization, it becomes a refuge, a place where displaced communities gathered after losing the coastal world their forebears had shaped. The rapid rise of cities like Eridu and Uruk may reflect a population consolidating its knowledge against the uncertainty of an unstable climate. The pattern of abrupt architectural sophistication, the presence of imported materials, the uncanny recurrence of symbolic motifs, all might be the residue of a cultural memory forced inland by the encroaching sea. One archaeologist studying submerged landscapes once remarked that the Gulf Basin was a museum turned upside down, its artifacts sealed beneath layers of silt rather than displayed upon them. The phrase lingers, unsettling in its implication that the earliest expressions of human settlement in this region lie not beneath the desert, but beneath the waves. And because these drowned plains have only begun to be mapped with modern tools, the silence surrounding them may hide entire chapters of human history. If so, the oldest stories of Sumer, of knowledge descending, of cities rising suddenly after periods of darkness, may be echoes of a world now unreachable except through geological inference. Standing on the shores of modern Kuwait or Bahrain, where the water glistens with the soft shimmer of morning light, it takes little imagination to picture how different this coastline once was. Fields of reeds stretching far outward, islands emerging from shallow basins, communities fishing along narrow inlets now sunk below the tide. The sea moves in breaths too slow for a single lifetime to notice, yet swift enough to erase the memories of generations. And from this erasure rises a quiet question, borne gently on the wind like a forgotten whisper. If the Gulf once swallowed a world, what other worlds might lie hidden beneath its restless surface? Far from the drowned coastlines and long-buried deltas, another kind of evidence waits in the sky. Not in the constellations themselves, but in the quiet ways ancient people measured their passing. Across the ruins of Mesopotamia, subtle alignments are etched into the foundations of temples, ziggurats, and ceremonial courtyards. These angles, preserved in brick and stone, point not only to cardinal directions, but to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the risings of particular stars. To some, these alignments speak of a society gazing upward with the curiosity of early astronomers. To others, they hint at something more complex, a transfer of knowledge, a continuity of observation that predates the cities themselves. The temple of Inanna at Uruk faces a slight deviation from true east, its axis aligned instead with the heliacal rising of Venus. This is not a trivial detail. Tracking Venus requires long-term observation across many cycles, each demanding patience and consistent records. Yet the earliest layers of the temple already maintain this orientation, as if the builders inherited astronomical knowledge from a tradition older than their own brickwork. Similar patterns appear in Nippur, where the equator seems subtly oriented toward the movement of circumpolar stars, and in Eridu, where early platforms correspond with southern skies that would have looked different millennia before the temple's construction. Astronomers who study these alignments often disagree about their implications. Some argue that the builders refined their techniques through years of careful observation. Others note that the precision in early temples seems too advanced for cultures supposedly recovering from social or environmental upheaval. The debate intensifies when one considers that the sky itself is not fixed. Earth's axial precession shifts the backdrop of stars slowly but steadily, altering their positions over long spans of time. Alignments that seem meaningful today may have been even more significant thousands of years earlier, before the eras we confidently chart in textbooks. A handful of ancient star lists deepens the mystery. Tablets from later periods preserve catalogs of constellations divided into 3 celestial paths, those of Enlil, Anu, and Enki. These divisions reflect declination bands now recognized in modern astronomy. Yet the lists appear complete from their earliest surviving versions, with no signs of gradual development. Even more puzzling are records hinting at constellations that no longer match the modern sky, as though they were based on observations made under a slightly different stellar arrangement. Whether these discrepancies arise from precessional drift or from older, now lost traditions remains an open question. On a fragment from Nineveh's Great Library, a scribe recorded an eclipse cycle corresponding to what later scholars identify as the Saros, a period of approximately 18 years and 11 days. Such knowledge requires centuries of continuous tracking. Yet the fragment gives no indication that the cycle was newly discovered or still uncertain. It presents the information plainly, with the confidence of a tradition already tested by time. How did this precision arise in a world supposedly still forming its intellectual foundations? Was it an independent achievement, or the survival of a legacy carried through generations of upheaval? Even more enigmatic is an artifact sometimes referred to as the planisphere, a clay tablet depicting a star map that some researchers believe records the sky during the 2nd millennium BCE. Certain interpretations propose it may preserve even older observations, though these claims remain disputed. Regardless of which reading is correct, the tablet exemplifies a broader truth. Mesopotamian scholars understood celestial patterns with a sophistication that does not emerge gradually in the archaeological record. It appears instead as a sudden dawn, bright, complete, and strangely familiar. Standing atop a ziggurat at night, surrounded by the soft hum of desert winds, one can imagine how these alignments once guided rituals, calendars, and communal rhythms. The stars would have marked seasons, migrations, harvests, and ceremonies. But they might also have served another purpose, anchoring human memory to cycles far longer than any written chronicle. In cultures where floods erased landscapes and dynasties rose from the mud of forgotten worlds, the sky offered the one continuity that could not be buried. And perhaps, in that continuity, ancient people found a way to preserve fragments of knowledge that survived where cities did not. Yet the unanswered question lingers, quiet as starlight. If these early observers looked to the heavens with such certainty, what older horizon had already taught them where to begin? Across the layered ruins of the earliest cities, one encounters objects that feel strangely out of place. Fragments of craftsmanship so assured, so technically confident, that they challenge the notion of a world just learning to shape itself. These are not grand monuments or elaborate inscriptions, but humble tools and engineered remnants found in workshops and forgotten storerooms, each carrying a quiet implication that the origins of technical knowledge may lie deeper than the layers in which they were discovered. In the site of Tel Es-Sawan, northeast of Samarra, archaeologists unearthed finely carved stone tools and figurines from a culture predating the earliest Sumerian settlements. What startled researchers was the precision of the work. Flint blades, napped with angles so exact they resemble modern microlithic tools, and figurines polished to a sheen requiring techniques not yet associated with the 6th millennium BCE. The community that produced these objects also practiced irrigation, one of the earliest in the region, building canals with gradients calculated carefully enough to channel water across uneven terrain. There is no fumbling prelude to this engineering. It appears already competent, already certain. Farther south, in the workshops around Eridu and Uruk, remnants of metallurgy surface centuries before the Bronze Age was thought to have begun. Bits of copper smelting slag, drills with hardened tips, and ornaments made from hammered metal hint at experimentation that seems both early and advanced. Some tools suggest the use of high temperatures requiring kilns more sophisticated than the archaeological record readily confirms. Scholars debate whether these artifacts represent independent innovation or the inherited skill of migrating groups whose own origins lie beyond the visible record. Perhaps the most striking example comes from the obsidian blades found across early Mesopotamian and Anatolian sites. Obsidian, harder and sharper than flint, fractures along remarkably clean planes. But crafting it into standardized blades requires knowledge of pressure, flaking techniques typically associated with much later cultures. Yet here they lie, in Neolithic layers, their edges still keen after millennia. Chemical analysis reveals that the obsidian often traveled vast distances, from volcanoes in eastern Anatolia or the Caucasus, suggesting trade networks or seasonal migrations spanning hundreds of kilometers. How did these early communities maintain such connections without leaving behind clear signs of intermediary settlements? In the city of Habuba Kabira, a southern Mesopotamian colony established in northern Syria during the Uruk expansion, archaeologists found evidence of standardized beveled rim bowls produced in quantities so large they can only be interpreted as mass production. These bowls, appearing almost identical across thousands of examples, reflect an industrial process, molds, kilns, and labor specialization. Yet no earlier prototypes have been discovered. The bowls emerge abruptly, their use widespread, as though the idea arrived fully formed. Equally puzzling are the early administrative tokens, small clay envelopes known as bulle that contain geometric tokens used for accounting. Their complexity predates writing, suggesting that abstract record-keeping systems were in place long before cuneiform. Some bulle contain markings that imply they were sealed for long-distance shipment, reinforcing the idea that early societies managed networks more intricate than the archaeological layers readily reveal. Even more enigmatic are the early string-cut bricks found at sites like Warka, ancient Uruk. Instead of being molded one by one, these bricks were produced in long slabs of clay, then sliced rapidly using taut cords, a technique that dramatically increased the speed of production. The brick sizes were standardized with a precision that implies planning and architectural forethought. Once again, there is no slow evolution of methods. The technique enters the archaeological record with a confidence that suggests prior experience. Standing amid these artifacts, one senses a recurring pattern. Knowledge appearing not as tentative experiments, but as reassertions, like the resurfacing of long-buried memory. The tools, the metallurgy, the engineering of canals, the mass-produced bowls, the standardized bricks, all seem to echo practices refined elsewhere or earlier, in places whose traces may lie beneath riverbeds, under shifting desert sands, or drowned beneath the Persian Gulf. And, in the hush of a museum hall, where these objects now rest behind glass, a quiet question echoes louder than the exhibits themselves. If the earliest technologies of Mesopotamia appear already mature, what earlier hands shaped the skills that these ancient craftsmen seemed merely to recall? In the dim corners of archives and storerooms, there are artifacts that do not command immediate attention. Objects made of clay, simple in appearance, fragile enough to crumble beneath careless touch. Yet these unassuming tablets are the ones that changed the trajectory of human thought. They are tablets of numbers, measurements, and geometric notations, inscribed with a precision that confounds anyone who tries to trace their origins. And when examined closely, they reveal a world that seemed to understand mathematics not as invention, but as recollection. Among the most striking of these is the tablet known as Plimpton 322. Its columns of numbers forming what later mathematicians recognized as Pythagorean triples. The idea that a tablet from the Old Babylonian period could reflect principles of right-angle triangles millennia before Pythagoras raises questions that ripple far beyond academic debate. But even more unsettling is the quiet confidence with which the scribe carved those numbers. No explanation, no derivation, no hint that the writer considered them mysterious. They are presented as facts, as though inherited from a tradition so old that the need to explain had already faded. Other tablets from Nippur, Kish, and Uruk show similar fluency. They contain tables of reciprocals, multiplication grids, and algorithms for computing areas and volumes. Some describe circular fields using approximations that come startlingly close to the value of pi. One set of tablets even outlines methods for solving quadratic equations through geometric analogy. These are not the hesitant steps of a culture discovering mathematics. They are the practice motions of minds comfortable with abstraction. But the deeper one looks, the stranger the landscape becomes. Many of these mathematical traditions appear abruptly, with no earlier stages preserved in the archaeological record. There are no beginner's exercises, no transitional notation systems, no crude attempts at formalization. The tablets emerge fully formed, as though they represent only the portion of knowledge that could be written, and behind them lies an older, perhaps unwritten, tradition now lost to the flood of time. In later royal archives, scribes often referred to themselves as keepers of the measuring rods, a phrase that suggests more than simple record-keeping. It implies stewardship over principles that govern both land and cosmos. Geometry, to these ancient scholars, was not merely a tool for surveying fields or building temples. It was a language of order, a way of binding the human world to the structure of the universe. The recurring ratios found in ziggurats, courtyards, and ceremonial platforms hint at a worldview in which mathematics served as both practical instrument and sacred inheritance. The most enigmatic traces of this inheritance appear not in numbers, but in the devices used to apply them. Archaeologists found clay models that seem to represent surveying instruments, strings knotted at regular intervals, rods carved with precise increments, and strange angular templates whose purpose remains unclear. Some scholars believe these were used to lay out temples aligned with stars or solstices. Others argue they were tools for canal engineering. Yet their precision suggests a level of mathematical standardization that cannot easily be explained by local improvisation. There are also the so-called measuring tablets, artifacts inscribed with instructions for dividing land into plots of equal area. Their diagrams resemble proto-architectural plans, rectangles, trapezoids, intersecting lines, drawn with an understanding of spatial relationships far beyond simple agrarian need. They imply that early Mesopotamian society valued proportionality, symmetry, and standardized layouts to a degree rarely acknowledged in textbook narratives. Even language preserves hints of this mathematical worldview. In Sumerian, the word for justice shares a linguistic root with straight and measured. Righteousness was conceptualized not as moral purity, but as alignment, an echo of a time when cosmic order and spatial precision were inseparable. If these concepts were metaphors, they were metaphors forged by hands accustomed to shaping the physical world with exacting care. Yet the question returns, persistent as a shadow cast across a tablet's edge. Where did such knowledge originate? Was it the product of countless generations quietly refining techniques along vanished riverbanks? Or did it descend into the early cities from an intellectual lineage now erased, leaving only its later branches visible? The mathematical tablets do not answer. They simply endure, silent, precise, strangely timeless, suggesting that beneath the visible layers of civilization lies a deeper geometry, one that human hands merely rediscovered when the world was ready to remember. Across the scattered cities of the ancient Near East, one pattern returns again and again, with a persistence that feels almost intentional. The ritual spaces where a civilization expresses its deepest memory often outlast the political structures that once supported them. Temples rise, fall, are rebuilt, and realigned. Their walls bear inscriptions of kings long forgotten, yet the core layout remains unchanged for centuries. If mathematics reveals the logic of ancient minds, then rituals reveal their emotional architecture. The part of memory preserved not in numbers, but in gestures repeated across generations. In Eridu, where some of the earliest temple foundations lie stacked like the pages of an ancient book, the continuity of worship is unmistakable. The sanctuary dedicated to Enki, god of subterranean waters, wisdom, and creation, evolves through more than a dozen building phases. Each temple rises directly atop the remnants of the one before it, preserving orientation, entryways, and internal proportions with a stubborn fidelity. This persistence hints at a ritual memory surviving environmental shifts, population changes, and the slow transformation of society itself. It is as though the community believed that altering the sacred blueprint would break a fragile thread connecting them to an older world. Similar patterns appear in the north, at sites like Tel Brak and Tepe Gawra, where ritual platforms and shrines retain structural features across centuries. In these places, archaeologists uncovered votive offerings, small figurines, miniature vessels, beads, and carved stones, left intentionally in pits and beneath floors. Many of the objects follow symbolic motifs far older than the temples that house them. The wide-eyed figurines at Brak, for example, appear in levels separated by long intervals, yet share shapes suggesting a shared ritual language, surviving through cycles of collapse and rebuilding. Yet, the most intriguing evidence of ritual continuity surfaces not in grand temples, but in modest domestic shrines tucked into the corners of prehistoric homes. At sites across Mesopotamia, archaeologists found niches containing clay figurines, small altars stained by ash, and offerings of grain or oil. These household rituals, simple yet consistent, reveal a worldview in which daily life intertwined seamlessly with cosmology, even as political structures shifted and cities rose or fell. These small rituals endured, preserving the spiritual grammar of the culture long after its myths began to change. The burial practices of early Mesopotamia offer another thread in this tapestry of memory. In the Halaf and Ubaid periods, bodies were often interred beneath house floors, accompanied by personal ornaments or tools. Later, as cities grew and social hierarchies crystallized, burial grounds became more elaborate. Clusters of graves, arranged with surprising order, sometimes with offerings that suggest belief in continuity between worlds. The famous royal tombs of represent the apex of this ritual elaboration. Yet even they echo patterns found in earlier, humbler graves. The presence of favored objects, the arrangement of bodies, the symbolic placement of vessels and tools. The scale changes, but the grammar remains. What complicates the picture is how these rituals interact with the political landscape. As kingdoms expanded, rulers claimed divine favor through ceremonial acts, restoring temples, sponsoring festivals, or inscribing prayers onto stone. Yet these royal inscriptions often describe their work not as innovation, but as restoration. They speak of bringing back the original plan, the ancient rites, the forgotten order. Such phrases appear in texts from Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Babylon, suggesting a widespread belief that the true pattern of the world lay in the past, not the future. Even the great festivals reflect this sensibility. The Akitu, a New Year celebration practiced across Mesopotamia, reenacted myths of creation and cosmic renewal. But the narratives it invoked, of gods descending, of primordial waters stirred into life, sound less like inventions and more like echoes of older cosmologies preserved through symbolic performance. The repetition of such stories, year after year, transforms them into vehicles of cultural memory, carrying fragments of belief across centuries of change. Some scholars argue that these rituals simply reflect the conservatism of ancient societies, a reluctance to alter traditions. Others suggest a deeper impulse, that rituals acted as mnemonic devices, preserving encoded knowledge, astronomical observations, seasonal cycles, agricultural wisdom, or even memories of earlier catastrophes, in forms accessible to communities that no longer possess the full intellectual framework of their ancestors. In this view, ritual becomes not just worship, but inheritance, the vessel through which a civilization guards what it cannot fully articulate. Standing inside the partial reconstruction of a temple, where sunlight angles through gaps in forgotten walls, and the dust carries the faint odor of ancient offerings, one senses the quiet persistence of these patterns. They survive not because they were understood, but because they were felt, carried through hands, voices, and movements long after their meanings blurred. And in that persistence, a question rises softly, like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. If rituals preserve echoes of a world prior to memory, what truths remain hidden within their repeated gestures? Power in the ancient world rarely arrived without a story to justify its place. Yet in Mesopotamia, those stories often feel less like inventions of kings and more like fragments of something older. Fragments repurposed, rearranged, but never entirely dismissed. Across tablets, hymns, and royal inscriptions, one finds a persistent notion that authority was not merely seized or inherited, but bestowed, descending like a mantle from a realm beyond the reach of human hands. This belief shaped the political landscape as deeply as irrigation shaped the land, binding rulers to myths that seemed to precede them by centuries. The Sumerian King List, preserved in multiple versions across different eras, presents this worldview with startling clarity. It begins not with a founding hero or a triumphant conquest, but with a declaration. When kingship descended from heaven, the phrase stands at the threshold between myth and governance, hinting at an origin that resists rationalization. Scholars debate its meaning, divine sanction, symbolic legitimacy, or a poetic framing of early leadership. But the list structure complicates every interpretation. Its earliest rulers reign for spans so vast they defy biological time, while later kings occupy more familiar human years. The abrupt contraction of these lifespans has puzzled researchers for generations, raising questions about what the compilers were attempting to remember or conceal. In the transition from mythic to historical kings, Kish occupies a privileged place. Yet, surrounding cities mirror this pattern. Larsa, Adab, Shuruppak, and Uruk all claim episodes of restored kingship, as though political authority were a wandering flame passed from one center to another across turbulent centuries. Many rulers describe themselves as shepherds chosen by the gods, but the phrasing is formulaic, almost ritualistic, suggesting they were repeating lines older than their own dynasties. The texts read like echoes rather than declarations, more reminiscent of memory than propaganda. Even more perplexing are cases where rulers explicitly state that they restored practices that had fallen into oblivion. Gudea of Lagash speaks of reviving a temple plan revealed to him in a dream. An architecture he claims originated in a time before the flood. Utu Hegal of Uruk describes returning cosmic order to the land, as though the world periodically drifted away from its intended design. These kings do not boast of innovation. They boast of remembrance. Their power derives from their ability to realign society with a pattern believed to be ancient, sacred, and perpetually at risk of erosion. The influence of priestly institutions further complicates this picture. At Nippur, scribes and ritual specialists held authority independent of political shifts. Their role as custodians of tradition allowed them to shape narratives across generations. In some epochs, they elevated certain rulers by linking them to mythic precedents. In others, they withheld legitimacy by omitting names from king lists or ritual texts. This selective memory reflects not merely politics, but a deep-rooted belief that history itself must mirror a cosmic template. If an event threatened the balance between human and divine spheres, it could be revised, minimized, or reinterpreted to preserve the larger pattern. Such revisions raise uneasy questions. How many stories were altered to maintain this cosmic symmetry? How many rulers vanished from lists, their deeds swallowed by the decision of a priestly scribe? And how many memories were reshaped to align with a worldview that insisted the past was both cyclical and sacred? The fragments that survive hint at forgotten tensions. Some tablets preserve laments for cities destroyed not by human warfare, but by divine withdrawal, as though the gods themselves judged a community unworthy of their presence. Others describe conflicts between priesthoods and rulers, each claiming to speak for traditions older than any throne. Within these disputes, one senses the shadow of a deeper struggle. Who had the right to interpret the past, and who could claim to restore the original order when its contours were already obscured by time? Standing before the remains of a temple or palace, where foundations overlap like overwritten text, one feels the weight of these layered narratives. Power in Mesopotamia was never simply administrative. It was woven from myth, ritual, cosmic order, and the careful curation of memory. And as these threads intertwined, they created a tapestry both luminous and opaque. A tapestry whose missing sections raise an inevitable question. If authority was tied to remembrance, what truths were quietly set aside to keep the illusion of continuity intact? Across the cracked plains, where ancient canals lie buried beneath drifting sand, a subtler kind of ruin emerges, less architectural than conceptual. It is the ruin of stories half preserved, of chronicles copied and recopied until their edges blur, of histories reshaped by those who believed they were safeguarding truth, while, perhaps unknowingly, altering it. The clay tablets that survive from Mesopotamia tell more than myths, laws, or inventories. They reveal a quiet struggle over memory itself. A battle waged not with weapons, but with styluses pressed into soft clay. As scribes in Nippur, Uruk, and Babylon compiled and edited the texts entrusted to them, they became the gatekeepers of the past. Their choices, what to include, what to omit, what to expand into poetry or compress into a formula, shaped the way future generations understood their origins. Yet the archaeological layers do not always align with the narratives these tablets present. Certain cities disappear from records long before their ruins show signs of decline, while others emerge in texts centuries before their earliest known foundations. The mismatch hints at a complex process of selective remembrance, where history was molded to reflect ideals rather than chronology. One of the clearest examples lies in the shifting portrayals of kingship. The Sumerian King List, though often treated as a historical document, was a living text, updated across centuries to legitimize ruling dynasties. Names were added or removed, reign lengths adjusted, and cities elevated to prominence or pushed into obscurity. Even the ordering of dynasties sometimes reflects political motivation more than historical sequence. When compared against independent inscriptions, administrative tablets, and archaeological timelines, inconsistencies emerge like cracks in a carefully polished surface. Yet these discrepancies are not errors. They are signals, evidence of a worldview in which history served not merely as record, but as scaffolding for cosmic order. Priestly schools reinforced this worldview through education. Apprentice scribes learned through copying canonical texts, absorbing not only vocabulary and grammar, but a particular interpretation of time. They were taught to see cycles rather than progress, restoration rather than invention. Each myth, each hymn, each ritual instruction framed human society as part of a grand pattern stretching into an age before cities rose from the plain. The past was presented not as a sequence of innovations, but as a golden template from which the present perpetually strayed and to which it must continually return. Yet behind this reverence lay an unspoken tension. Certain fragments discovered in lesser-known archives contain versions of myths that differ subtly from their canonical forms. Variants where heroes behave differently, where gods speak other truths, where events unfold in ways that contradict the accepted narrative. These alternative versions, often preserved on tablets broken or forgotten in storerooms, suggest that the official stories were distilled from multiple competing traditions. The process of refining them into singular texts may have concealed as much as it revealed. The flood narrative is one example. Different tablets preserve different names, different warnings, different divine motives. In some versions, the flood is punishment. In others, it is an accident of cosmic conflict. In still others, it resembles a natural disaster refracted through symbolic storytelling. Archaeology confirms a series of regional floods around the time often associated with the myth, but none on the scale described in epic poetry. Perhaps the scribes who shaped the story sought not to describe geology, but to encode a deeper truth about cycles of destruction and renewal. Truths inherited from memories older than writing. In later periods, as empires rose and fell, history became an increasingly political tool. Neo-Assyrian kings carved narratives of conquest onto palace walls, blending rhetoric with selective omission. Babylonian scholars reinterpreted ancient tales to reinforce their own claims of divine favor. Even the genealogies preserved in certain temple archives shift subtly across time, adjusting lineage to suit new regimes. Through all this, the underlying thread remains: a belief that the present must reflect a past sufficiently ordered to justify its existence. Walking through the ruins at twilight, when the outlines of walls soften and the desert wind carries faint echoes of forgotten chants, one senses that the struggle over memory never truly ended. The tablets we read today are both windows and mirrors, revealing ancient worlds while reflecting the hands that shaped them. And amid the fragments, a quiet uncertainty grows. If the custodians of the past once curated history to preserve cosmic balance, how much of what we believe today is likewise a carefully arranged reflection rather than an untouched truth? Among the most revealing artifacts of the ancient world are not the monumental inscriptions etched with kingly pride, nor the lavish wealth uncovered in royal tombs, but the quiet remnants left behind by those who never imagined their hands would be remembered. A potter's discarded shard, a mason's alignment mark on unfinished brick, a scribe's abandoned tablet bearing half-drawn signs. These small traces accumulate like the dust of centuries, forming a different kind of archive. Unlike royal narratives, these fragments do not argue. They merely exist. And in their mute persistence, they hint at an older, more elusive continuity beneath the official chronicles. Across the city of Uruk, beneath layers of construction and collapse, excavators uncovered pits filled with broken tools and misfired pottery. At first glance, these refuse deposits seem to reflect nothing more than the routines of daily labor. Yet closer examination revealed something unusual. Among the fragments were tools of varying styles, some made with techniques associated with much earlier periods. A chipped blade crafted in a manner characteristic of Ubaid artisans appeared in a stratum thousands of years younger. A fragment of pottery painted with halaf motifs surfaced in a context far removed from its place of origin. These pieces had not simply survived, they had been carried, preserved, perhaps even revered as symbols of continuity in a world repeatedly reshaped by time. Similar anomalies appear in the storerooms of Nippur, inside chambers filled with discarded tablets, exercise pieces from scribal apprentices. Archaeologists discovered signs no longer in use during the periods in which the tablets were written. Some were archaic logograms, others numerical notations associated with earlier systems. Their presence suggests that scribes were trained not only in contemporary forms, but in a lineage of knowledge stretching backward through centuries of transmission. A scribe, learning a sign no longer used, was not merely practicing language. He was being inducted into a memory older than his own city. In Lagash, fragments of older ceremonial vessels were found reburied within foundations of later temples, sometimes wrapped in clay envelopes or placed into pits sealed with plaster. These were not leftovers discarded by builders. They were deposits intentionally concealed. The vessels bore symbols long out of active use: spirals, bird-headed figures, geometric grids whose purposes remain obscure. Their deliberate burial within new structures suggests a ritual act of remembering, as if each generation sought to anchor itself to an ancestral thread by embedding fragments of an older world within the walls of the new. Even in domestic spaces, memory leaves its quiet imprints. At Shuruppak, beneath floors of later homes, archaeologists found hearths from earlier dwellings left undisturbed, sealed beneath layers of clay but never destroyed. Families built above them, aligning their new hearths with the old ones below. Such alignments may have been pragmatic, respecting architectural stability, or symbolic, preserving the spiritual center of the household. Either way, the choice reveals a subtle reverence for continuity, a desire to remain linked to those who came before, even when their names were forgotten. More enigmatic still are the fragments of musical instruments discovered across multiple sites. Lyre arms carved in forms reminiscent of animals now absent from the region. Flutes crafted from reeds whose species no longer flourish in the marshes, and soundboxes decorated with motifs that appear in disparate cultural contexts. Music, by its nature ephemeral, leaves behind only these incomplete echoes. Yet the recurrence of similar forms across great distances suggests a shared auditory lineage. Songs, rituals, or tonal systems pass through migration or memory, persisting long after the cultures that birthed them vanished. Certain seals carry this continuity further. Cylinder seals, used to imprint images onto wet clay, often depict mythic scenes or combinations of symbols whose meanings blur across time. Some motifs continue for centuries, others appear suddenly and disappear without trace. Yet when compared side by side, seals from distant eras occasionally reveal patterns that recur in cycles. Composite beings, intertwined serpents, celestial symbols arranged in triads. These recurring images feel less like artistic coincidence and more like traces of a symbolic system returning after periods of silence. What unsettles researchers is not simply the persistence of older forms, but the selective ways in which they reappear. Some fragments clearly serve practical purposes. Others were imbued with ritual significance. But all share a common feature. They do not fit neatly into the narrative of linear progression. Instead, they hint at cultural memory resurfacing unpredictably, as though the past rests just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment or the right hands to call it back. Walking through the storerooms of a museum, where trays of pottery shards and tool fragments sit labeled yet largely unstudied, one senses the enormity of what remains unexamined. Each piece holds a silent testimony to countless decisions made by people who lived through cycles of creation and destruction. And within this silence, a question rises with the softness of dust lifted by a passing breath. If fragments of forgotten worlds continue to echo through the smallest objects, what larger truths lie hidden in the memories we have yet to uncover? There are ruins that speak in crumbling walls and fractured surfaces, and then there are ruins that speak only through the emptiness surrounding them. In the western desert, where the Euphrates once carved a winding ribbon through the land before veering east toward the sea, lie the ghost remains of Mari, once a nexus of trade, diplomacy, and ritual, a threshold between Mesopotamia and the cultures of Syria. Unlike the deep-layered cities of the southern plain, Mari rose suddenly, flourished brilliantly, and collapsed with a finality that still unsettles those who walk among its skeletal mud-brick corridors. It stands as a reminder that even in a world seemingly defined by cycles, certain breaks arrive with such clarity that they feel almost like deliberate erasures. When archaeological expeditions first uncovered the palace of Zimri Lim, its labyrinthine rooms held archives of diplomatic letters, ritual instructions, and economic records that revealed a city connected to lands far beyond the Fertile Crescent. The letters spoke of envoys traveling through unfamiliar mountains, gifts exchanged with distant kingdoms, and omens read from celestial signs. But beneath these confidently written lines, something quieter lingered, a sense that Mari was a crossroads, not simply of trade, but of stories, ideas, and memories migrating invisibly between worlds. In one chamber, tablets describing rituals to call upon protective spirits were found alongside older fragments written in a script that predated the city's own foundation. Some scholars believe these fragments were heirlooms, preserved intentionally by priestly lineages. Others suggest they were relics carried by migrants whose ancestral homes had long since vanished beneath shifting rivers or encroaching sands. Whatever their origin, their presence complicates the narrative of Mari as a mere political entity. It suggests a city consciously curating memory, gathering fragments from different eras and weaving them into its own ceremonial fabric. Yet the suddenness of Mari's destruction disrupts any notion of timeless continuity. Around 1760 BCE, the city fell to Hammurabi of Babylon. Fire swept through its palace, collapsing roofs and scorching archives. Ash sealed some tablets in perfect preservation, while reducing others to outlines of lost words. The violence of the destruction feels stark against the backdrop of earlier sites, where layers accumulate gradually like sedimentary memory. Here, memory was not layered. It was severed. The broken walls reveal a final paradox. Beneath layers of ash, archaeologists discovered ritual spaces left untouched by the flames. Altars arranged with small vessels, figurines placed in niches, traces of incense still embedded in the clay. These intimate spaces, preserved by accident within the catastrophe, echo practices seen in far older settlements, household shrines at Telisawan, votive pits at Tepegara, offering niches in the earliest levels of Eridu. Even as Mari stood at the edge of the Bronze Age world, its rituals were shadows of gestures that stretched back across millennia. If its political life was violently ended, its spiritual lineage continued to whisper from the corners of rooms no conqueror bothered to search. And so, Mari becomes more than another fallen city. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the uneasy truth that civilizations, no matter how grand their architectures, how intricate their bureaucracies, or how wide their alliances, carry within them the remnants of worlds long vanished. They rise on the foundations of forgotten hands. They speak languages shaped by tongues no longer remembered. They invoke gods who sometimes feel less like creations of their age and more like echoes of ages buried beneath the earth. As night settles over the ruins and the desert chill creeps into the hollow corridors, the silence deepens. There is no wind to stir the dust, no distant river to break the stillness, only the faint hum of emptiness, a reminder that time, too, can be a kind of eraser. And in that deepening quiet, the mind drifts inevitably toward the threshold where the known world dissolves into speculation. Perhaps the most haunting question is not what was lost when cities like Mari burned, or when floods buried the earliest settlements, or when rising seas swallowed ancient coastlines. The question is what remains, hidden in rituals carried forward unconsciously, in symbols that outlived their meanings, in the geometry of temples rebuilt again and again atop older plans, in the fragments of objects preserved long after their makers turned to dust. For as the dusk gathers its final light over the desert, the ruins seem to breathe with a soft, lingering awareness. Not a warning, nor a revelation, but something more elusive. The sense that memory itself moves like water, sometimes pooling, sometimes evaporating, sometimes seeping quietly beneath the surface where it waits, patient as stone, for the moment it can rise again. And beneath that feeling lies an image, subtle as a heartbeat in the sand. A world always on the cusp of remembering itself, even as its oldest stories slip beyond the reach of words. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. Your presence, your curiosity, and the quiet moments we've shared in these stories mean more than words can hold. If tonight's exploration stirred something in you, a question, a sense of wonder, or simply a moment of calm, I invite you to stay close. Follow the channel. Share it with someone who dreams through history as you do. And let's continue uncovering the echoes of forgotten worlds together. Until we meet again, may your night be gentle and your thoughts drift softly into the realms where memory and mystery intertwine.